So this is our, ooh, I don't know where my mouse went. So this is our Mishnah of the day, and we're going to dive into each part of it. Starting with, I'll just give a little bit of background onto who Shimon was. So the Mishnah, this is Mishnah 17, but Mishnah 16 is spoken by Rabbi Gamliel. So the reason why, Mishnah 17 starts with Shimon, his son, would say, is because it's coming after Mishnah 16, where it was talking about Rabbi Gamliel. So he is the son of Rabbi Gamliel. It's a continuation of Mishnah 16, and Shimon is the son of Rabbi Gamliel. Now, something interesting to note, which we will discuss in depth, is that this man we're talking about who said this phrase, Shimon, he was the grandson of Hillel. So I think we've discussed this last year, who were Hillel and Shammai. These were the two great sages of the time, and they had very opposing opinions, right? It says that they only agreed on 7 laws, right? There's 613 laws in the Torah. They disagreed on everything except 7. And Hillel, why did they disagree so much? Because they had different approaches to each part of the Torah. Hillel was known for chesed, for kindness, and Shammai was known for gevura, strength. And so Hillel approached every mitzvah with the approach of kindness, of chesed, and Shammai approached the same thing with gevura, with strength, with discipline. And it says that actually we almost always go by Hillel. There are a few exceptions where we follow Shammai's ruling, but in majority of cases, we go by Hillel's opinion. Now, Shimon was the son of Gamliel, who was the son of Hillel. So he is the grandson of Hillel. And we'll discuss why that's important soon. So let's just go over a basic interpretation of what Shimon says, line by line. So he has 3 main points here. The first point is that, I would say 4 main points, actually. The first point is that he grew up among the sages. And the second point is that growing up among the sages, what he learned is that silence is the most important thing for a person. The third point he makes is that action is more important than study. We'll discuss how that ties in. And number 4 is that speaking excessively or speaking nonsense or like empty chatter can bring a person to sin. I think these are the main 4 points that he makes. So the Bartenura, who is like one of the main commentators on the Mishnah, explains these 4 points. What does he say? This is a more basic understanding of the Mishnah. What does he explain? He says, all my life I grew up among the sages, and I found that silence is the most important thing, right? He says, what is Shimon referring to? He's referring to staying silent in the face of controversy, meaning when somebody feels criticized by another person, what Shimon is saying, the most important thing is to remain silent. Fighting back, arguing back, giving an answer is never going to be productive. It's only going to make matters worse. And so the Bartenura, there isn't so much context here, right? He just says silence is the best thing for the body. What does that mean? The Bartenura explains he's talking about in the face of criticism. When somebody criticizes you, to remain humble and not to fight back. Why? Why should we not fight back? Like we said, number 1, it's usually not productive. It almost always makes things worse. And number 2, he says, is that it's a lesson in humility, because either what the person is saying is true, and if the person's criticism is true, then take it as constructive criticism and maybe examine yourself and say, is there something here that I need to fix within myself? And if it's not true, if what the person is criticizing you for is false, then it's not your problem. It's their issue. They're the ones who are, bringing up false accusations. Don't get into a battle with them. Don't get into it with them. Okay, it's their problem. That's their issue. have a little bit of humility and be able to walk away without having the last word. Silence is a virtue. That's what he's saying here. Now, the second point is study is more important than deed. Now, what we're going to learn in this Mishnah is that this ties in very beautifully because, of course, we know that Torah study usually consists of speech, right? Right now, we're learning Torah and we're speaking to one another. We're conversing. And so it's interesting to note that Rabbi Shimon would say that silence is the most important thing, because if we look at Torah study, if we look at the Talmud, for example, the entire Talmud consists of speech. The format of the Talmud is a conversation between the sages. This sage says this, and the other sage retorts, and the other sage gives his opinion, and it's a back and forth. And sometimes it's even like a neck to neck argument where the sages are disagreeing with one another and they're arguing back and forth and back and forth. So it seems like the Torah learning, like the Talmud itself, is filled with conversation, filled with speech, and not just speech, but sometimes it's arguments, it's back and forth disagreements. And so that's why he clarifies by saying the essential thing is not study, but deed, meaning when it comes to your ego, somebody threatens your ego, silence is the most important thing. However, when it comes to Torah study, you shouldn't stay quiet. You should give your opinion, right? The sages were always opinionated. They always had an opinion when it came to the Torah law. So what he's saying is, in the context of learning, your opinion does matter. You shouldn't stay silent. However, learning is not the most important thing. In fact, deed is the most important thing. That's what he ends with, because what he's showing here is there's a balance. He goes back and forth. He says silence is the most important thing. However, Torah study is also important. Don't stay silent in a Torah study conversation. But back to the first point, deed is more important than study. So in the Talmud, there's actually a question that says, what's more important, Torah study or mitzvot? And it's a back and forth, and there are many different opinions. Like we said, every rabbi has their opinion, but the final conclusion is that Torah study is more important. Why? Because Torah study leads to action, meaning it's a means to an end. If a person is learning Torah and it's not leading them to action, then they're not really fulfilling the mitzvah of Torah learning. They're not doing it correctly. They're lacking something. They're learning about Torah. They're not actually learning Torah, because Torah has to affect you. Torah has to change you. When you learn Torah, you have to walk away from it differently, with a different perspective, with a different outlook. It has to have an effect, because that's the point of Torah. Unlike other intellectual pursuits where, you learn to become knowledgeable, or you learn for the sake of learning, right? You learn because it's an academic subject. But Torah is different. Torah is something that has to have an effect on you. It has to change you in a certain sense. And so that's why he's saying, that's why the Gemara, the Talmud says that Torah study is greater than deed, because Torah study leads to deed. If a person only does actions, they're not going to get Torah study with it, right? If you only do the mitzvot, you're not going to also have Torah knowledge. But if you have Torah knowledge, then that will lead to mitzvot. So that's why Torah is so important, not because of the study itself, but because it leads to a person doing mitzvot and becoming a more refined human being. And finally, we have one who speaks excessively brings on sin. So I think this is the wrap up of all the other things he was saying, where he's saying basically that speech that is meaningful, speech that is productive, as in Torah study, is a good thing, because it leads to deed, it leads to action. But speaking excessively, meaning speaking about nonsense or gossiping or, talking chitter chatter for no purpose, can lead to sin. We'll discuss why. But it's just interesting to note that we live in a world where talk is cheap, right? We love to talk. We live in a world of social media. So everything is about people giving their opinions and their ideas. And we have talk shows and we have newspapers, magazines, interviews, tabloids, exposés. Everyone's trying to talk. Everyone's trying to make their voice heard. And it's beautiful to center ourselves on the words of the Mishnah, the words of Rabbi Shimon, that teaches us this powerful lesson about silence, that there is beauty in silence, and silence is golden in certain cases. Sorry. So, I think it's powerful to stop and remove ourselves from the chitter chatter gossip of the world, right? Everyone, if you go on like any news outlet, gossip is like, that's the best thing to do. If you gossip about someone, you're going to get a lot of views because it's interesting, it's intriguing, it's what people want to hear. And it just shows how gossip can really lead to sin. Gossip is a sin, but excessive talking leads to sin because it leads us to talk about other people or to talk negatively, and in other ways as well, it can cause a sin. So let's go through some of the interesting. We're going to examine the text of this Mishnah because we know that every word in the Torah is precise, and some of these phrases have a lot of depth behind them. Starting with the very first three words, which is Shimon beno Amar. So why does it call him Shimon the son, his son, Rabbi Gamliel's son? This is a very interesting terminology, especially for the Mishnah, because if we looked at any other Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, it almost always begins with the rabbi who said it, and it starts with Rabbi so-and-so said. But here we have a very interesting term where it says Shimon, his son. It doesn't say Rabbi Shimon. It just refers to him as Shimon, the son of Gamliel. And what's even more interesting, we know in many Jewish communities, we name after like a father or a grandfather or the closest relative that has passed away. So Shimon, this rabbi we're referring to here, he had a son named Gamliel because his father was Gamliel. When his father passed away, he named his son after his father. And his son Gamliel had a son named Shimon because his father was Shimon, who passed away, and he named after his father. So this Shimon that we're referring to has a grandson named Shimon, the son of Gamliel, just like he is Shimon, the son of Gamliel. And later on in the Mishnah, it actually quotes his grandson, and it refers to his grandson as Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, this is very strange because we see that his grandson merited this title of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. But when he is referred to, it doesn't say Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. It says Shimon, just Shimon, the son of the rabbi we spoke about earlier, which is Gamliel. So what's going on here? Why does this Shimon not warrant the title Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? And his grandson does, who had the same exact name as him. And so it's explained that this points to Shimon's great humility. And this is exactly what he says in the beginning. He says, I was raised among sages. Shimon lived at a time where there were many sages living in Israel, ruling the Jewish people, guiding the Jewish people. So he lived in a time of many, many sages. And so because there were other sages, other great leaders, other great rabbis at his time, he didn't want to refer to himself as Rabbi Shimon because he saw himself as one of the sages. This is his humility. It really points to his humility that he didn't want the Mishnah to refer to him as Rabbi Shimon because he didn't view himself as such. He viewed himself as among the sages. He was just one of the sages. Even though we know he was a very great rabbi, great leader, he didn't want to be referred to as such in his humility. And this is another reason why in other places in the Mishnah, interestingly, he refers to himself as Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel. Now, we said before that Hillel was his grandfather. But whenever the Mishnah or the Gemara says Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, what it's referring to is the students of Hillel. They all had one approach. And so whenever the students of Hillel had a ruling, it would be under the title Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, because they were like the students, the groupies of Hillel. And so he kind of disguises himself or camouflages himself under the name of his grandfather, because again, in his humility, he doesn't want to take credit or honor from his Torah teachings. He wants to be humble, and he wants to just go incognito, unrecognized, under the name of his grandfather. And it shows the humility of this Rabbi Shimon. Now, back to the words, right? The teachings of Rabbi Shimon. I'm going to share my screen once more. Oops. Okay. So he says, let's dissect the words that he uses, right? So he says, all my life, I grew up among the wise. The first lesson I think that we get here is that the people you surround yourself with have an effect on who you become. Shimon starts off telling us what was his environment. Where did he grow up? He grew up among the sages. And what did he learn from growing up among the sages? The power of silence. Now, I think the first lesson, like I said, is that our environment, the people we choose to surround ourselves with, will have an impact on us, whether we recognize it or not. Sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes it happens over time, but essentially the people we surround ourselves with impact who we are. And so the first lesson is to surround ourselves with people that are positive influences, people that exude positivity and kindness, and like Shimon, to surround ourselves by people that are wise and righteous. And what does he mean by silence? It's very interesting that there's no context here. Like I said before, he doesn't say, why doesn't he say, in Torah study or in meaningful speech, it's good to talk, but nonsense rather remain. When it comes to nonsense, just stay silent. Don't voice your opinion. When it comes to arguments or chatter that has no depth or no meaning. He doesn't give context like that. He just says simply, silence is the best thing for a person. Another question that comes up is the word that he uses. If we look at the Hebrew text, it says, lo matzasi lo guf. What does guf mean in Hebrew? Guf means body or a corpse, right? It's interesting that he uses this word, right? Why wouldn't he use the word or the phrase? He could have said, the best thing for a person is silence, or the best lesson, the best, there's other words that he could have used that would seem more appropriate. Why does he specifically use the word guf, body? The best thing for your body is silence. Interesting terminology. And thirdly, I think that another question that could come up from this text is, someone who speaks excessively leads to sin, right? That's what he says. What does that mean? How does it lead to sin, right? We're not talking about gossip. He doesn't say gossip will lead to sin. Gossip in itself is a sin. He's saying speaking excessively leads to sin. How could this be? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives a beautiful explanation of this Mishnah. And we'll go through it now. But basically, when what the Lubavitcher Rebbe teaches us here is, if we think that Rabbi Shimon was, perhaps he was not a great Torah scholar, right? This is just in theory, right? He says perhaps he wasn't so learned, and that's why he's saying silence is great, because for somebody who's simple, right, staying silent could be a very positive thing. Um, there's a joke of like, it's not really a joke because it's said in the Talmud, but it says that silence is great for the wise. How much more so for a fool? It's like kind of a bit of an insult, but it's actually has a deep meaning, where it's saying if somebody remains silent, they can seem more smarter than they are. For example, sometimes when a person's having, either speaking or having a conversation, the more a person tries to fill in their words, like, trying to fill the empty spaces of a conversation, sometimes it makes them look less smart instead of smart, which is interesting because you would think someone who's talking is very smart, but that's not always the case. Sometimes excess speech actually makes somebody seem not so smart. So perhaps what Shimon is teaching us is, or saying to us is, if somebody is, not so great, silence is better. But that's not the case with Shimon, because what we're going to see from his words, if we look at the Hebrew words of the text, it says gadalti, right? He grew up among the sages. Now, the word gadalti is another interesting phrase, because gadalti, if anyone knows the word gadol in Hebrew, gadol means big or great. So I think in a subtle way, Shimon is telling us, Kol yemei gadalti ben chachamim. What does this mean? If we translate the word gadalti as great instead of growing up, what he's saying is, I became great among the sages. What's he saying here? That his whole life, because he was among the sages, he became great. He was always becoming greater and greater, rising in his greatness, in his knowledge, in his Torah knowledge, in his piousness. He was becoming greater and greater. Why? Because he was among the sages. What's he teaching us here? Often, people try to reach heights of greatness through, what's the term? Like trying to make themselves great. The focus is, I want to achieve something. I want to be great. I want to stand out. I want to be unique. I want to be successful. I want to pursue my own self-aggrandizement. And that's what they are seeking in their greatness. But what Shimon shows, both from the term Shimon, where he doesn't add the word Rabbi Shimon, he just uses the word Shimon, and from the words Ben Chachamim, among the sages, we see that he's telling us, my greatness came specifically from not pursuing my own greatness. Because I associated myself with other sages, and I didn't do it to become great. I did it because I was genuinely interested in what the sages had to teach me. I remained silent. I absorbed the teachings and the knowledge of these sages. That's how I became great. It's almost like an oxymoron. Like, specifically by not pursuing my own greatness, that's how I became great. Because I referred to myself as one of the sages, just among the sages. I'm just among them. I'm not the sage. I'm not the rabbi. I'm just among the sages. I'm learning from them. I'm soaking it all in. And that can only happen from silence, right? Because he remained silent, that's how he became so great. He was able to absorb and be an open vessel for all the knowledge of the sages because he remained silent. It's almost like a cup, that if a cup is filled with water, that cup cannot, if you pour like a faucet, you turn on a faucet and you pour it into a cup that's filled with water, what's going to happen? The water just spills over. You can't fill up a full cup, right? So because he was an open, empty vessel, that's how he was able to accept and take in the water, so to speak, or the knowledge of the sages. Because he was an empty vessel, he was open to learning from them. On the other hand, if a person is already full of their own ego or of their own knowledge, they're not a vessel. They're not open to learning from others. And so it's this 2-point lesson that he's showing us. He's saying, my humility is the source of my greatness. The reason I became great, obviously he doesn't say this straight out because that wouldn't be such a humble statement, but he's trying to teach us a lesson here, right? He's trying to say, I grew up, I became great because of my humility, because I was an open vessel and I was ready to accept the knowledge, the teachings of the sages. Now, when we come to talk about silence, right? It kind of goes against our human nature. There's a mashal, which is like a parable about two waves that are riding along the ocean. And the one little wave sees the rocks coming up ahead. And he turns to his fellow wave and he says, oh no, we're going to crash into the rocks and we're finished. We're going to perish. Our life is over. As soon as we hit those rocks, we are no longer our own little wave. And the other wave says to him, no, you're not going to stop being a little wave. You're just going to become a great big ocean. The lesson of this parable is that the little wave is so concerned about his own little identity. And he's focusing more on his identity than what he can achieve, which is to become part of the great big ocean. And this is kind of what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us, that because he wasn't focused on his own greatness, on becoming his own identity, his own ego, he was able to absorb and become part of this great ocean, which is like the other sages of the time. He was able to become part of the group of sages because he wasn't so focused on his own ego and becoming the greatest of them all. And that came through silence. Why? So, like I said, like I started to mention, this concept of, achieving greatness, but not for your own aggrandizement, kind of goes against our human nature, right? We know that we're both made up, every person is made up of two conflicting or opposite things, which is a body and a soul. Our bodies desire one thing and our soul desires something else. I'm sorry if there's some background noise. I think there's like construction in my building, so I hope you don't hear it, but I apologize if you can hear it. Sorry. So we are all made up of a body and a soul, right? And this concept goes against our body's nature because every body, like on a physical level, every person seeks greatness for themselves. Every person wants to feel special. They want to feel unique. They want to feel like they are great on their own. And we see this phenomenon in small children, right? Like a lot of times we bribe, or teachers will bribe kids with, you get to be the star student. You get to be the best in the class, right? Kids want that I'm bringing up children because it shows how natural it is. It's not something we necessarily learned. It's something that we have in us naturally, that we want to feel special. We want as kids, we want the teacher to acknowledge us and say, you were the best in the class today. Or we want our parents to say, you did the best job out of everyone else. We want to feel like we did better or greater than everyone else. That's a natural bodily need or desire. So Shimon is acknowledging this, and that is why he uses the word guf. He uses the word body, because he's saying, I understand that this phenomenon can be very hard and almost against our nature, right? Like we said, our nature is we want to feel great. We want to feel unique. We want to feel like we are special, like we achieved greatness in our life. And he said, that's normal. That's a normal thing for the body, right? And that's why he says the best thing for the body is silence. Because just because the body desires something doesn't mean that we have to give into it. Meaning, just because your body desires to have this ego that feels very inflated and feels better than everyone else doesn't mean that you have to give into it. And that's why silence is the best thing for the body. He specifically uses the word guf, body, because he's teaching us this lesson that just because our body wants something or craves something doesn't mean we have to give into it. There's a beautiful story of one of the Rebbe's, the Maggid of Mezrich. He was the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's a story that a man once came to him and said, I'm really struggling with negative thoughts. I have these thoughts that bombard me from morning till evening, and I just can't get them out. They pull me down, they drag me down, they make me feel depressed. How do I deal with these negative thoughts that just pop into my head and bombard me all day? And so the Rebbe said to him, go, I have the perfect solution. There's a man who can teach you exactly how to control your thoughts. And he gave him the address, he gave him the village, and this man set out to find this man that will teach him how to control his thoughts. When he arrived at the man's home, it was a cold night, it was rainy, it was cold. He knocks on the door, and the man doesn't open the door, but he calls out through the keyhole, who is it? And the man says, hi, this is my name. I was sent here by the Maggid of Mezrich, this Rebbe. He told me that you can teach me how to control my negative thoughts. I'm here to learn from you how to control my negative thoughts. And the man says, nothing, no answer. And so he continues to knock. He says, hello, please let me in. It's cold, it's rainy, let me in. I'm here, I was sent here by the Rebbe. Please let me in. And for an hour, keeps on going. He knocks and the man ignores him, and he knocks again and he begs him and he pushes him, please let me in. It's cold outside. And for some reason, the man will not open the door. Finally, after a few hours of this going back and forth, the man opens the door and he says, who are you? And he says, what do you mean? What's going on? I've been outside of your door for over an hour knocking and pleading for you to open the door. I'm here. I was sent by the Rebbe to learn from you how to control my negative thoughts. And the man says to him, I just taught you how. You were knocking on my door constantly, and I chose not to let you in. And he says, just because a thought is knocking on your door, meaning knocking on your brain, doesn't mean you have to let it in. You don't have to entertain every guest that knocks at your door. You don't have to give in to every thought that your brain has, every desire that your brain has. Just because you're having these thoughts that are trying to bombard your mind doesn't mean you have to let them in. You are the owner of your home. You are the owner of your mind, and you get to choose who you allow in and who you do not allow in. And the man, of course, walked away with this powerful lesson that sometimes the thoughts are really pushing, and they're trying to get into our brain. They're trying to control us. And the lesson that this man taught him is that you don't have to allow them in. You get to choose. You get to control which thoughts you entertain and which thoughts you turn away. And so this is the same lesson of Rabbi Shimon teaching us here, that our body is going to have a lot of thoughts, a lot of desires, a lot of things that our body is interested in. But it doesn't mean that we have to give into it. And he says you can silence your body, right? By choosing not to give into it, by choosing not to go along with every thought or every desire that your body has, you are in control and you can silence those thoughts. Now, what would be the if we took this to an extreme, right? So there is a way to take this to an extreme. If a person says, okay, the Torah is teaching me here that I have to learn to neglect the things that my body desires. So maybe I should become a monk, live on the top of a mountain, and focus on spirituality all day. Now, this is also not the Torah way. And that's why Shimon clarifies with the next line, which says, the essential thing is not study, but deed. What's he teaching us here? Number one, he said, we have to learn how to silence our body, right? Our body has certain thoughts, our body has certain desires. Learn how to silence them. But don't always silence them, meaning there are certain things that your body is needed for, and that is deed. Mitzvot, like we've spoken about in the past, mitzvot are almost always engaging our physical body, right? On Shabbat, we eat challah. In Judaism, we don't believe in celibacy. We believe in the beauty of family, the beauty of relationships. We believe in using physical objects for spiritual purposes, right? And so the other side of the coin is not to neglect your body, but to maximize it and use it for spirituality, use it for goodness. And that's why he says action in Judaism is the most important thing. It's even more important than study, because the whole purpose of study is action. The purpose of study is to lead us to action. If we sit and learn Torah and we only speak the words of Torah, but we don't walk away with a lesson learned, or I'm going to do things a little bit differently, I'm going to, grow and be inspired, inspiration that leads to action, right? Not just inspiration that I feel good and fuzzy after I learn, but actually inspiration that has to lead to action. And so this is like a fine line that Rabbi Shimon is teaching us, this very nuanced idea that on one hand, greatness comes from silencing the desire of the body to feel big and great and egotistical. Silence that part of your body. Push it away. Don't allow it in. Focus on being a recipient, being an open vessel, learning from the sages, learning from other people. Stay silent and listen to others, right? There's this, it's a very interesting idea that when you have a conversation with somebody, you know everything you're about to say. So when you're speaking, you're not learning anything new, right? By staying silent, you actually learn more than by speaking, because everything you're about to say, you already know. You're not learning anything new. When someone else is speaking, you're learning everything that they say you didn't know before. So you're learning something new from them. So silence leads to learning more. But on the other hand, he teaches us that silence is not always the necessary thing. Action is actually what should replace the silence, meaning instead of focusing on, don't just humble yourself in every situation. Also, action is the most important, more important than, action is more important than Torah study, because it actually accomplishes things in this physical world. And so it's this fine line of the body and the soul, right? The body has certain desires and the soul has certain desires. And we live in this multifaceted human experience where half of us, sometimes we feel very in tune with the body side of ourselves, and sometimes we feel very in tune with the soul part of ourselves. When we feel like we're chasing after materialism and the car that we drive or the house that we live in or the vacations that we go on, when those are the things that are dominating our mind or taking priority in our life, we're having too much emphasis on the body. When we feel that the connections, the love, the relationships, Judaism, spirituality, connection with God, when those are the things that are taking precedence in our life, we're in tune with the soul of ourselves. And we constantly go back and forth, right? Nobody's perfect. Everyone has this constant battle of, I'm a body, but I'm also a soul, or am I a soul and also a body? Do I want to pursue materialism or do I want to pursue spirituality? And we go back and forth. And what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us is how to balance the two. When the body desires something negative, silence is the key. Silence is golden. But the soul can use the body for goodness. The soul can use and maximize the abilities of the body to do actions. That's why he talks about deed, because deed involves the body. Deed is not something that you can do in your mind. It has to be done physically in actuality. And so that's why he brings both points side by side. Now, the last phrase of this Mishnah is one who speaks excessively brings on sin. What does this mean? So what's interestingly, the word chet in Hebrew, which translates as sin, has the same numerical value as the word chisaron. What does the word chisaron in Hebrew mean? It means a disadvantage or a lacking. Now, what he's saying here is that excessive speech can lead to a lacking. A lacking of what? So to say speaking is a sin is very extreme, right? We know that speaking nonsense is not really a sin in itself. He's saying it could lead to a sin because it's like saying small talk is a sin. No, small talk is not a sin. But if a person is always engaging in small talk and just loves to chatter with everyone and anyone, eventually they may end up speaking negatively about another person. They may end up spreading gossip. They may end up, putting down another person or speaking about something negative, and that can lead to sin. So what he's saying here is it's not really a sin, it's a disadvantage, meaning every person has their potential, right? And so one person's potential may be 100, but if they're only doing 50, they're not really reaching their potential. They're lacking in something, right? Whereas another person, if their potential is only 40, if they reach to 40, they've maximized their potential. And God judges us on a person to person basis, right? He doesn't have one scale that everyone has to live up to. It says that when a person goes up to heaven, God isn't going to ask you, why weren't you like Moses? Or why weren't you like Samuel? Or why weren't you like David? God is going to ask you, why weren't you the best you that you could be? Why didn't you maximize the potential that I gave you? Not Moses, not David, not all these great rabbis, but you. I gave you a certain potential. Why didn't you live up to that? And so what he's saying here is that there's a certain lacking. If a person who has the ability to engage in meaningful discussions is excessively speaking about nonsense, they're lacking something. They're not reaching their potential, and they're lacking an opportunity, right? Because we know that speech is very powerful. And every conversation can either be nonsense and meaningless, or it could be filled with purpose and meaning. And if we don't view our interactions with other people as opportunities for meaning, for connection, and to share with each other meaningful ideas or meaningful experiences, we're lacking something. There's a chisaron in Hebrew. There's a disadvantage. We're taking something so powerful as speech, right? Speech is so powerful. And that's why in some cases silence is needed, because sometimes speech is taken advantage of. It's something that we have an unlimited number of. We have an unlimited amount of words. And so sometimes we take advantage of those words and we use them for nonsense. And so what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us here is we have to understand the power of our words. We have to understand the weight that our words carry, and use them appropriately. Use them for Torah and holy purposes. So I think just to wrap up these ideas, what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us here is, first of all, that what a person should pursue, which we learn from him, is greatness, but not for the sake of greatness. Pursue greatness by humbling yourself and learning from others. By silencing yourself, you can reach to greatness. When a person pursues, he's teaching us a very powerful lesson that when a person chases after greatness, they're not going to become great. When a person chases after meaning and knowledge and good deeds, they will automatically reach greatness without pursuing their own ego. And we learn this from his humility, and we learn this by his emphasis on silence, that greatness comes from silence, from learning and absorbing other people, what other people have to share. And secondly, what we learn is that the words that we say have weight. They carry weight, and we should use them wisely. We should use them appropriately. We should try to, even if it's in a small way, use our conversations with others to connect, to learn, and to make this world a better place, right? That's why he says that deed is the most important thing. The purpose of study, the purpose of speech is to lead to action. That's why later on in the Pirkei Avot, a little more famous Mishnah, it says that Emor me'at ve'aseh harbe, which means speak a little and do a lot, right? That's a bit more of a well-known English phrase. Speak a little and do a lot, meaning there are people that are talkers. There are people that run away with their words, but their words don't carry weight because they don't have the actions to back up their words. And what Shimon is teaching us here is that actions are more powerful than words. And words can lead us to action. Words can lead us to an understanding that will lead us to action. But the goal is not the words. The goal is the action. And so in many cases, silence is what's most necessary because actions don't require words. Actions speak for themselves. And so that is the lesson of Rabbi Shimon. The power of silence, the power of learning from others, and the power of action, of speaking a little and doing a lot. And the words that we do speak should be meaningful, should be filled with kindness and connection. And also, like we spoke, the word guf, the word body, emphasizes that we have the ability to silence the body. If the body thinks a certain thought or desires a certain thing, it doesn't mean that we have to give into it. We have the power of silence. We have the power of saying no. We are in control of our actions. We are in control of our words. And we have the power of choosing silence, of choosing to silence negative thoughts or words or actions. So I think this Mishnah really does speak for itself. It's a powerful lesson. Even, as I was learning it, it opened my eyes to understand the power of silence. When I first read it, I was like automatically drawn to it because I was like, ooh, what's the deeper meaning here? Why is silence the best? He uses very strong words. He says, he didn't find anything as good as silence, right? He says like the best thing for a person is silence. And that automatically drew me in. I was like, what is so powerful about silence? So yeah, I hope that was clear and understandable. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to share now. Let me unshare my screen so I can see everyone's beautiful faces. Let's read some of these comments in the chat because they're very interesting. They always say he who speaks first loses. Also, you can't listen when you are talking. Exactly. You can't listen and speak at the same time. And that's actually we spoke about this in the past, but I think it was last week, we spoke about the power of listening, right? When a person, when you're having a conversation with somebody, there's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is you hear what they say, but you're hearing it in order to respond. So you're more focused on your response, what you have to share, than what they have to say, which is the opposite of what Rabbi Shimon is teaching us, that true listening requires silence. And silence doesn't only mean like your mouth is shut and you're not saying words. It also requires, I think, mental silence, right? Sometimes someone's speaking and our brain is racing with 100 different thoughts. How am I going to respond? There's also a concept of mental silence. Clear your mind and be focused and mindful on what this person is sharing with you. So hearing is passive and listening is active. When you're hearing, you're passively hearing what the other person is saying, but you're more focused on what you're going to respond than what they're saying. When you're listening, you're silencing your brain, you're silencing your thoughts that keep popping up like, ooh, I want to say this and I want to respond this. No, listening requires silence. I listen to you, I focus on you, and I truly absorb the words that you're sharing with me. That's the difference between hearing and listening. And like, I think it's Myra that says, you can't listen while you're talking. If you're talking, you're not learning anything new. You're just talking. When you speak excessively, you aren't listening to others. Yes, Judy, exactly. That's the point. When we also discussed this, I like how everything connects, right? So last week we mentioned the idea of kindness, right? We said that kindness doesn't mean reaching to the other side of the ocean and helping somebody on the other side of the world. Oftentimes, kindness is something as simple as being sensitive to the person sitting next to you, right? It's harder to be kind to the people that we know really well, the people in our life, than, feeling like a kind person by sending money to a charity across the world, right? It's easy to be kind to people we don't know. It's harder to be kind to the people that we interact with every single day. And so, where was I going with this? So like Judy was saying, when you speak excessively, you're not listening to others, because when you fill the spaces of a conversation with your words, what you're really missing out on is being sensitive to what the other person is trying to communicate with you, right? Sometimes those pauses in a conversation, when you have a conversation with somebody, sometimes if you calm your mind and you also calm your mouth, right? You stay silent for a moment, you can pick up on certain nuances that the person is trying to communicate with you, right? And that's part of kindness, like we spoke about last week. Kindness is not always sending a big check to somebody. Kindness is noticing the nuances of what a person needs, like noticing that a person is looking a little down today and saying, I notice that you don't look like usual. Is something bothering you? Do you need help? Can I be there for you in any way? A lot of times the most powerful expressions of kindness come from someone noticing something very sensitive, someone noticing something that you're feeling that you're not always expressing or articulating. And that comes from silence, right? You can only pick those things up if you remain silent and focused on what the other person is going through. I think that's a connection between what we learned about kindness last week and silence, that I think silence is the road to that, to being sensitive. So, ooh, I like that. Jane says that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth because we're supposed to listen. Wow, I love that. Very powerful, Jane. Thank you for sharing that. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth because we're supposed to listen double as much as we speak. So as much as we speak, we should listen double that. What would confidence contradict this teaching? Interesting. So Valentina asked a question, if confidence would contradict this teaching. Does anyone have any thoughts on this question? It's a good question. Anyone want to share what their thoughts about this question? I think that sometimes we think that, okay, this is how I view it. When two people are having a conversation, if somebody is uncomfortable with silence, it usually comes from an insecurity, I think. Usually remaining silent takes more confidence than filling in the gaps. An example I think would be like, imagine a teacher that the student asks a question, right? And the teacher doesn't really have an answer to the question, but the teacher doesn't want to seem unknowledgeable, so they make up an answer that doesn't really get to the root of the question. Versus, cut to a teacher that is asked a question which they don't really know the answer to, and the teacher says to the student, you know what, I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I'm going to get back to you. Which one really takes more confidence? I think the teacher has the confidence to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you. I'm going to look into that. And instead of scrambling together some kind of answer, usually is more confident than the teacher that is trying to fill in with an answer that doesn't really get to the root of the student's question. So I would say that confidence and remaining silent don't contradict. They actually could go together. They could go hand in hand, because remaining silent usually takes more confidence than filling in with words, right? We all can fill in the gaps of a conversation with random words or words that just fill the conversation, versus pausing to formulate our thoughts and to answer the person directly. Meaning, there's two ways to answer somebody. I think there's answering someone, you can answer the question or you can answer the person, right? If someone asks you a question, you can either answer the question or you can answer the person who's asking the question, right? Two people can ask the same question, but they're looking for two different answers. They're looking for two different things. One person can be asking the question because they simply need an answer, and another person can be asking the question because they need support or they're looking for something deeper. And so the only way to really decipher what the person needs or what the person is asking is through silence, is through like recognizing what the person specifically needs and answering them, which takes silence. If anyone has any other thoughts, because I think these questions are like discussions that we can have, and like we can delve deeper and deeper into them. But yeah, that's a beautiful question. You mentioned the vulnerability of speaking. Can speaking be beneficial to the speaker? Definitely. I think when I said that speaking, you don't learn anything new, I want to clarify that point, because I think when I speak about a subject, it like solidifies the subject in my mind. It definitely does. So I want to be clear about that. Like, you gain from speaking as well. Like when I read a subject, let's say I read a book that I'm really excited about, right? When I go to my sister and I'm like, oh my God, listen to this book that I just read, and I give it over to her, it definitely like solidifies the idea in my mind. And sometimes when you speak about something, you even become more passionate about it than when you just read the words, because speaking about it like builds up that passion in you. So there definitely is an advantage to speaking. But I think the key difference here is meaningful speech versus excessive speech, right? Excessive speech connotes that you're speaking excessively. It's unnecessary speech, versus speech that's meaningful, right? Right now we're speaking, but we're discussing Torah ideas. And so we're speaking about meaningful human experiences, meaningful Torah concepts. And so if we walk away from this class and it remains conceptual, then we could argue that this speech was excessive, right? But if the speech leads to action and it leads to self-refinement, or it leads to any type of positive outcome, then it's not excessive, then it's meaningful, then it's purposeful. So that's not the kind of speech we're talking about here. We're specifically, Rabbi Shimon is talking about excessive speech, speech that leads to nothing. Okay. If I'm not being clear, I mean, I know these questions are being asked in writing, so it's not always the same. If you want to ask the question, like turn off your mute button and ask it in words, then maybe I could get to the root of what you're asking, but I'll do my best from the chat messages. So Fern asked or said, this chapter speaks to the well-known Parsha in Shemot. Nasev v'nishma. We shall do and we shall hear. Action is most important. Don't overthink. I think that speaks for itself. Beautiful. If anyone isn't familiar with what Fern is referring to, when the Jewish people received the Torah, it says that they said two words. God offered them the Torah, and they said two words, like Fern said, Nasa v'nishma. What does this mean? The word Nasa means we will do, action. Nishma is listen, hear. Beautiful. I didn't even think of this. That's beautiful, Fern. Wow. Nasa v'nishma means we will do and then we will hear. Why does do come before hearing? Because the Jewish people were saying, it's not like we're saying, well, listen to what the Torah has to say, and then we will make an executive decision and we will decide what we want to do. They were actually saying, we're going to do it. Like, we're so enthusiastic about this. We're going to do everything, and then we'll learn the details, the intricacies. We'll examine the Torah. We'll ask questions. And God wants us to do that. He doesn't just want us to do it blindly. He doesn't want us to just do the mitzvot. He wants us to learn about them. He wants us to understand them and love them and feel them. So we are going to learn about them, but first we're going to commit to doing them. So in this case, action comes before the learning, the talking, or the listening. That's a beautiful, beautiful connection. Thank you for bringing that up. And lastly, we have some people, like me, talk to organize their thoughts. But I think the core of this is that we have to be aware and try to make our speech meaningful. A question to ask that I learned on a JWRP trip was to ask, is this helpful or harmful? And use that criteria. Beautiful. Yes. So like I was saying before, speech has its advantage, right? Speech can clarify thoughts, like Myra was saying. It can also bring up new thoughts, right? Sometimes when you start to talk about something, mid-sentence, mid-conversation, you have this like epiphany of like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. Because speaking it lets you flesh out the idea. Definitely. So fleshing out an idea in speech has its advantage, but I think it only, like Myra was saying, only if it's helpful speech, right? Meaning, if you're talking about something positive, something meaningful, something holy, speaking about it makes you more passionate and more excited about it, or it solidifies the idea in your mind. However, on the flip side, on the negative side, if somebody is talking, let's say someone does something that hurts you or bothers you, right? Usually talking about it to someone else makes you more passionate, like we said, both for positive and negative. It makes you more passionate. It can make you more angry, and it can make you more defensive. So both for positive and negative, meaning someone did something that hurt you and you respond by talking about it with someone else, it usually brings those feelings to the surface. It makes them bubble up. It makes them more intense. It makes them more resentful. Whereas, talking about something positive also solidifies those feelings. So I think it works both ways. When we talk about positive things, it solidifies those ideas and those feelings. When we talk about negative things, it also solidifies them. So we have to be careful what we talk about, with whom, choose our words very, very wisely, and always remember that silence is the key. Silence is golden. There's a beauty in somebody being able to remain silent and take in what the other person has to say. And it's not to remain silent forevermore. It's to remain silent at the right moments. When it's time for you to share your thoughts, right? We're not supposed to be mute. We're supposed to share our thoughts, but only after you've really, truly accepted and taken in what the other person had to say. And that comes through silence. So yeah, I think that's beautiful. I really liked the questions in the chat. I love that. So thank you all. Thank you, ladies. And yeah, it's a little bit of a different concept, but I think it's a powerful one. And thank you all for joining today. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts in the chat. I appreciate it. Someone sent a screenshot in the chat. I'm going to open it. And thank you, Meryl. I'll wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, even though today's Thursday. Oh, wow. So Carol Rydell sent something interesting in the chat. If anyone wants to open it up and read it through, I'm gonna, as soon as I log off, Carol, I'm gonna read it. I'm very interested. So thank you, ladies. Have a great day and Shabbat Shalom. And hopefully we'll see some of you in synagogue on Shabbat. Bye, everyone.